Welcome back, everybody. Today we are continuing our discussion of what happens after the Civil War. Today we'll be looking at Chapter 18, Section 1, Part 1, Early Steps to Reunion. I decided to split this lesson in two parts because there's one section especially that I feel is just too important to kind of lump it in with everything else. So I pulled that out, and we'll talk about that next time. But today we're going to look at the early steps that the United States took to try and repair itself following the Civil War. We know in the previous chapter we talked all about the Civil War and the different groups of people that it impacted, and finally, by the end of it, the North won, the country is united once more. Now what? So we're going to look today at some of the early steps towards full reconstruction and repairing of the entire country following the Civil War. And our key terms for today are freedmen, Reconstruction, the 10% Plan, amnesty, the Wade-Davis Bill, the Freedmen's Bureau, and the 13th Amendment. Now, we discussed the 13th Amendment a little bit in our introduction, but today we'll get into it a little bit more. But first, I want you to take a look at these two pictures of the same person, Mr. Abraham Lincoln. You may remember this first picture that we saw when we talked about him first getting into politics. Look at him. He looks so young and fresh, but we know that would not last. This next picture was taken following the end of the Civil War. And I want you to look at his face, and especially take a look at his eyes. Conflict can really take a toll on a person. On a very small scale, I remember when I was younger and I would get into fights with my parents, I would physically feel sick if I knew that things had not been resolved or if there was still anger or animosity between us. Now, if that's ever happened to you, take that feeling and then multiply it by hundreds and hundreds of times. Lincoln had been willing to fight the Civil War to preserve the unity of the United States, but it took a toll on the country, and it really took a toll on him as a person. Even when you do things for the right reasons, there are still consequences.
In 1865, as it becomes clear that the war is drawing to a close, no one in Washington knows quite what to do. Abraham Lincoln cannot negotiate a treaty with the Confederate government, a government he insists has no legal right to exist. But neither can he simply readmit Southern states into the Union as though nothing has happened.
Because Lincoln would never accept the idea that the Confederacy existed as a separate nation, then there's the question of, well, just what was going on in the South then for those years, from 1860 to 1865, after South Carolina secedes until Appomattox. If it's not part of a separate nation, what is its status? And so there were these elaborate constitutional theories developed. Did Southern states somehow commit suicide, so they sort of ceased to exist? Or did they go to sleep? In essence, the abstract governments are still there, but they've somehow gone dormant. Or do they exist in a state of rebellion, but not actually an independent nation? That was Lincoln's solution. And the reason why that's important has to do with how representation will take place. When are you going to bring back Southern politicians into Congress? On what terms?
If you can imagine the South even more confused, their whole social system destroyed, vast portions of their land destroyed, railroad ties upended, houses, factories burned, whole cities burned, some of them by their own soldiers. When the Southern soldiers left Petersburg, when they left Richmond, when they left Atlanta, they set the fires to the warehouses and the manufacturing to keep them out of Northern hands. So the destruction was amazing and terrible. The Southern soldiers being paroled, coming home, trying to find their families. Many, many Southerners in the countryside were refugees. They really had nowhere to live.
Leaving aside then the physical destruction, probably the really crucial other salient point is the sort of psychological consequences. of having a region where even those white Southerners who weren't committed passionately to the Confederacy still had suffered an enormous loss with the abolition of slavery, or as a result of Confederate currency being worth nothing, or the psychological loss of having committed themselves to a cause and then seeing that cause utterly and completely defeated. So there isn't any simple way to describe what the South must have been like in 1865.
After the war, both the North and the South had to try and adjust to the newly reformed country, but the adjustments that had to be made in the South were far greater than those in the North. Most of the battles had been fought in the South, so towns, farms, railroads, many of these had been completely destroyed, while others had been severely damaged. This picture we're looking at right now is actually of Charleston, South Carolina. Only a handful of battles had been fought in the North, so most of the soldiers from the North were able to go home and go right back to work, right back to the jobs that they had left. The factories there that had been pumping out war materials no longer had those contracts, so jobs weren't as plentiful as veterans hoped for, but it wasn't that long before the economy was back to where it was and booming once again. However, like we said, in the South, the situation was much different. With much of the land that had been dominated by years of fighting, former Confederate soldiers had very little to come back to. Entire cities had been leveled, farms had been burned, and about 2/3 of the railroad tracks had been twisted and were now completely unusable. Plus, all the money that the Confederacy had printed before and during the war no longer had any value, so banks closed and people lost what little money that they had left. Along with these difficulties, there was the fact that a whole new class of citizens had been made up of freedmen, and freedmen were the about 4 million men and women that had formerly been slaves and were now free workers. So you have soldiers returning, very few jobs, cities that have been completely destroyed, farms that have been completely destroyed, and about 4 million new citizens looking for work. So this is a very, very significant change from before the war.
At home again, but so many changes. It does not seem the same place. The bare, echoing rooms, the neglect and defacement of all. Gardens, orchard, and fences are mostly swept away. Nothing is left but to endure.
When Kate Stone and her mother returned to their Louisiana home after the war, they were nearly bankrupt. There was no credit to be had. Of the 150 slaves they had owned, only a few remained at Broken Burn. The Stones had safeguarded the family's silver before their escape. Now, it was a reminder of the wealth and position the family had lost. What the women mourned most were the men who had sacrificed themselves for the Southern cause.
Many white Southerners find themselves facing, as Kate Stone does, a defeat that has taken the lives of her brothers and her uncle and so many of the people she's known. When Kate's oldest brother, who is not killed in the war, comes back, he hardly speaks, she says, for many months after his return. This was a civilization in which 3 out of 4 men of military age served. Many of them were in the war for years on end. How could we not expect that that experience and defeat and slaughter and tragedy would have left them, in some sense, wounded?
All these hundreds of thousands of Confederate soldiers are going back home, uncertain of what they're going to find and uncertain of what they're going to do. As they look around and see the free black people refusing to just do what white men tell them to do and trying to create freedom for their families, everything looks to them as an insult and as a threat. White Southerners say, we've got to make clear who's boss. We've got to make clear that we are in control of all of this.
In Washington, President Johnson shared white Southerners' concerns over growing black independence in the South.
Johnson is seeing a black population who have abandoned the plantations. People who are demanding that they be treated in a decent fashion. And Johnson believes they should return to their former places of work, and above all, should accept their subordination to white power and authority.
Andrew Johnson believes there's going to be a reconciliation between North and South. There's going to be a reconciliation of white Northerners and white Southerners. And if black people have to be set aside, fine.
The president abandoned his strict policy toward the planters. By fall of 1865, he was pardoning so many that special clerks had to be hired to keep up with the paperwork.
Johnson thinks that only the planters can really keep these African Americans under control. So very quickly he begins to bring the wealthy planters back into his Reconstruction policy in order to really impose subordination on the former slaves.
Planters only want to be pardoned so that they can get their land back. And so Andrew Johnson complies with their wishes, pardoning 15,000 to 20,000 planters, hundreds of them being pardoned every day. When these planters then are pardoned, they return to their islands and to their acreages all over the South, and they want the people who are then living there removed.
Lincoln was worried about the Reconstruction of the South. He personally believed that the sooner the South was brought back into the Union, the sooner the country could start healing. Lincoln started making his plans for Reconstruction as early as 1863, so in the middle of the war. And it was in 1863 when he outlined his 10% plan, in which a southern state could form a new state government after 10% of its voters swore an oath of loyalty to the United States. So once the new government was formed, it had to abolish slavery. Then it could send senators and representatives to Congress, and everything would be great. He also wanted to offer amnesty to those former Confederates that swore loyalty to the United States, but not to former officers. And amnesty is just a general pardon for any wrongdoing. So any of the former Confederates, specifically any of the former Confederate soldiers, if they swore an oath of loyalty to the United States, Lincoln would just offer them amnesty, but not former Confederate officers. And Lincoln's plan met with a lot of opposition in Congress because many saw that it was being too lenient on the South. In 1864, a bill was passed called the Wade-Davis Bill to rival Lincoln's plan. And the Wade-Davis Bill stated that a majority of white men in each southern state would have to swear loyalty to the United States, and it denied the right to vote or hold office to anyone who had volunteered to fight for the Confederacy. So Lincoln's plans, the 10% plan, stated that if 10% of the population swore an oath of loyalty to the United States, they could then create their own government. And once they did, they had to abolish slavery, and then they would be allowed to take part in the national government. On the opposite side of that, the Wade-Davis Bill, which was signed in order to oppose that, stated that a majority of white men in each southern state would have to swear loyalty to the United States, and it would deny the right to vote to anyone who had volunteered to fight for the Confederacy. How do you think Lincoln felt about the Wade-Davis bill? Well, he refused to sign it because he felt like it was too harsh. So from that, we can take that he wasn't too pleased with the Wade-Davis bill. So you have 10% plan on one side, Wade-Davis bill on the other. Now, there was one proposal that was made by President Lincoln that Congress and Lincoln could agree on, and that was a bill that would create the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau would help former slaves and poor whites. The Bureau provided food and clothing, and they looked for jobs. And probably the most important job of the Freedmen's Bureau was that it set up schools for freedmen. And in doing so, it laid the foundation for the South's public school system. It also created colleges and universities for African American students, including Howard, Morehouse, Fisk. These are all universities that are still in operation today. And by the 1870s, graduates of these colleges were teaching in grade schools throughout the South. So the one thing that Congress and Lincoln could both agree on that Lincoln had proposed was to set up the Freedmen's Bureau to help former slaves and poor whites. It would provide food and clothing. It would provide for the temporary, the immediate needs, as well as set up schools for the needs down the line. So it would help to feed and clothe these former slaves, but also educate them. And as we've talked in the past about reform movements, education is the key to growth.
The future is uncertain, and yet in various parts of the country, people talk about their expectations.
You had two goals, reuniting the country, but also emancipation and freedom. What did that freedom mean? Nobody knew what that meant. Not the ex-slaves or the freed people, not the politicians of the North, and not the Northern people. We do know this. We do know that the vast majority of white people in the 19th century were not ready for endowing black people with equal rights or giving them the full rights of citizenship. That would be a hard battle to win.
It's very frightening. And it's not as if freed people don't know what they want. They know exactly what it is they want. They want literacy and they want land. And there had been promises. In fact, some representatives had spoken to Lincoln, and Lincoln had said, well, what do your people want? And they said, we want 40 acres and a mule. We want the land that we have worked legitimately, that should be ours, or at least some portion should be ours. And we would like a free labor system as is set up in the North.
A logical thing would be to take property from the old planter class and redistribute wealth to the new freedmen, and maybe even to some of the plain folk in the South, the white people. But that flies in the face of everything that is capitalist. If property is not safe in South Carolina, then is it secure in Boston? And the answer, of course, is no.
Even before Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox, Congress establishes a Freedmen's Bureau.
Well, the Freedmen's Bureau had fewer than 1,000 agents to serve the entire former Confederacy. You can just sort of map them out and figure that that's an inadequate number of people to meet the needs of former slaves, let alone the millions of white Southerners. And so the U.S. Army in the South ended up performing a whole host of other functions, bolstering the Freedmen's Bureau, as well as local military authority during the period of so-called military Reconstruction in the South.
Just how extensive is this military presence during Reconstruction?
It's not as though there was a huge military presence in the South. Symbolically, of course, it was enormously important, because having federal troops in the South demonstrated the continuing resolve, tentative as it may have been, but still the continuing resolve of the federal government to impose order on the South.
Provisional plans for reuniting the country begin to take shape long before the guns are silenced.
I think Lincoln really believed that he could bring about a very peaceful Reconstruction that would not only reconstruct the South, but would also restore or replenish the Republican Party, and maybe even hold on to power in the most unlikely of places, the defeated South. So Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was rather gentle. As soon as 10% of those people who were eligible to vote in 1860 had taken an oath of allegiance to the United States, the states could rewrite their constitutions, write slavery out, affirm the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, and rejoin the Union.
Many of those Republicans disagreed with Lincoln's lenient policy during the war, hated it, were ready to punish the South, did not want to let the South back in without making them pay a price. And that price would be not only emancipation, but perhaps black suffrage, civil rights, and other disabilities that they were wanting to impose on the South.
There are, of course, not that many Northerners who were willing to adopt that position because it had enormous implications and challenges for the federal government. But within those two poles, between get the Union back as quickly as possible and let's create a new Jerusalem in the South, there was a wide range of opinions.
Unfortunately, Lincoln never got to see his plan for Reconstruction come to pass because on April 14th, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln was shot and killed while attending a play. And after shooting the president, actor John Wilkes Booth leapt from the president's box and shouted the Latin phrase "Sic semper tyrannis," which means "thus always to tyrants." Lincoln died the next morning, and Booth was later caught and killed in a barn outside of Washington, D.C. Now, we'll talk about this more in our next section. Remember how I said at the beginning of the lesson that there was one section that was just too important to gloss over? Well, I'm pulling Lincoln's assassination out, and we will talk about it next time in more detail because there are just so many things going on with that.
Just a few days into his second term in office, Lincoln's life comes to an abrupt end. On the night of April 14th, 1865, as he and his wife are attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, John Wilkes Booth, an actor obsessed with the Southern cause, slips into the presidential box and shoots the president. Lincoln is carried to a house across the street, where he dies early the next morning.
A more disastrous event, it's hard to imagine, coming as it did at a time where just only days before, killing had gone on. What could have happened? We know that John Wilkes Booth was hunted down and a group of conspirators were rounded up, arrested, and later endured a military trial and were hung. But if we look at what its impacts could have been, well, the Northern Army was still in place in Virginia and other places in the South. The soldiers could have been so angry that they would go crazy. They would erupt into riots. And in fact, many Northern generals were afraid of that, and they calmed the troops. And they reminded them that President Lincoln, most of all, would have wished for a peaceful ending to this, that he wouldn't want a war to erupt over his assassination. And so it didn't happen.
The loss of the president is yet another chapter in the legacy of pain the nation has been enduring in this war between brothers.
Now that President Lincoln is dead, Andrew Johnson succeeded him as President of the United States. Johnson had been a representative from Tennessee, but when his state seceded, he stayed loyal to the Union. Republicans in Congress believed that Johnson would support stricter measures for Reconstruction, but he turned out to be much more lenient than they expected. Johnson's plan called for a majority of voters in each state to pledge loyalty to the United States and for each state to ratify the 13th Amendment, which banned slavery across the nation. There were no conditions about Confederate soldiers or Confederate officers, so a lot of states said, all right, we'll take it, and they hurried up and met Johnson's conditions. Now, once former Confederate states met Johnson's conditions, they were now allowed back in the Union. And following readmission in 1865, voters elected their representatives for Congress and for their new state governments, but continued to deny African American men the right to vote. Georgia, for example, chose former Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, as their governor. How do you think the Republicans in Congress felt about these elections? That's right, they were outraged. How could men who were in charge of the South's secession be allowed to take part in the national government of the United States like this? So when the new Congress met, Republicans refused to let Southern representatives take their seats, and instead set up a committee on Reconstruction to form their own plan for the South. So from here on out, it was Congress versus the President on the issue of Reconstruction.
For the first 48 days of Andrew Johnson's presidency, Southerners waited anxiously to hear what he would demand before allowing them back into the Union. On May 29, 1865, Johnson announced his plan for what would be called Presidential Reconstruction.
There was good evidence in 1865 that a lot of white Southerners, leadership even of the Confederacy, would have accepted relatively harsh policies at that moment. But very soon it became clear that Andrew Johnson wanted a rapid, lenient restoration of the Union with as little alteration of the Constitution and the creation of black civil and political rights as possible.
Johnson would issue blanket pardons for most former Confederates. The rebel states would be encouraged to form new governments quickly. Washington would not interfere. The president's leniency surprised many in the North. Southerners responded with relief.
Johnson actually sets only the most minimal requirements. All they have to do is admit we lost the Civil War. The Civil War is over. Slavery and secession are dead. Other than that, there are no requirements.
Johnson was harder on the planter aristocracy. He insisted that wealthy planters and Confederate leaders write him personally and beg for clemency.
This basically eliminates the planter class from leadership of Southern politics. If you're not pardoned, you can't vote, you can't hold office, and you can't get your property back if it's been seized by the federal government.
Andrew Johnson had no sympathy for wealthy planters. He had risen from poverty and identified with poor white Southerners who, before the war, had far outnumbered the slave owners. Now, he was anxious to protect poor whites from what they saw as a new threat.
Poor whites have to face the fact that now that black people are free means that they have to compete with this new element for livelihoods, for social positions, and for political power, ultimately. And this is a very frightening thing.
Johnson's aim is to bring the white South and the white North back together. African Americans just do not play a role in Johnson's vision of the post-war South other than to go back to work and be landless and rightless plantation laborers.
Johnson's contempt for the freedmen infuriated many in Washington, and none more than Thaddeus Stevens. The congressman from Pennsylvania had been a fierce abolitionist long before the war. Within the Republican Party, he led a small, vocal faction known as the Radicals.
These were principled men. Before the war, they had been the strongest Republicans opposing the expansion of slavery. During the Civil War, they had been the first ones to call for arming of black troops, for issuing an Emancipation Proclamation. Long before there was any conceivable political benefit to be gained from supporting the rights of black people, they were doing it.
The radical Republicans had a vision of what Reconstruction should be. They believed it should be longer in duration. They believed the Southern states had left the Union and had destroyed their status as states. They had to be reinvented. To Thaddeus Stevens, Reconstruction meant not only safeguarding and preserving the essential results of the Civil War, but in his vision, it meant remaking the South. It meant the increase of democracy in terms of representation. It meant the spread of the right of suffrage.
The radicals' hard line marginalized them within their own party. Most Republicans feared the radicals' position on black rights would drive away white voters in the North.
It is the radical wing which is the most sympathetic to black people. The party in general was committed to a limited program of civil rights, protection of property, education, etc. But the party is not in any way committed to any sort of radical restructuring of Southern society.
Johnson's Reconstruction Plan could not be challenged until Congress convened in December. That summer, radical leaders could only watch as scores of planters descended on Washington, pleading to be pardoned. Whose petition would be denied or granted was uncertain. Still, former Confederates were hopeful. White men alone, President Johnson told one senator, must manage the South.
Which brings us to our assignment for today. Now, there is no written assignment for this lesson, but I want you to go back and review this section because you will need that for the upcoming quiz in a couple of days. So remember, next time we'll be talking about Lincoln's assassination, and then from there we'll be moving on to the different plans for Reconstruction. Like I said, from here on out, it was Congress versus the President on the issue of Reconstruction.